A lot of Christians have an awful lot of growing up to do when it comes to misogyny. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Let's take a look at a video.
If Christian women only knew how hard it was for men to stay pure, they wouldn't dress the way they did at the gym.
No, we're not going to do this. I don't care what they are wearing. Stop putting the blame on victims.
The way the first man was framed by the second was completely disingenuous. And what the first man was saying was not that it was okay for you to be hurt simply because of what you're wearing. That's not what he was saying, even a little bit.
Well, the second speaker never said anything about it being okay. They were talking about who is to blame, who is responsible. But I think we have two different outcomes in mind, because I think that second speaker was addressing issues of sexual assault. I don't think the first speaker was addressing that. I think they were talking about men running home from the gym to go rub one out because of how aroused they became looking at other women in the gym, which is entirely the responsibility of those men. And so to the degree that the concern here is who is responsible for that man's sin, then yes, he was precisely saying that. He may not have intended that. That may not have been what was on his mind, but that's part of the message that he communicated, at least according to the audience. You see, you are not in charge of or in control of how other people are allowed to understand what you're saying. You see, when you speak something or write something or sign something, you're no longer in control of what it is allowed to mean, because you've just encoded stuff that was in your head. And everyone who encounters that linguistic expression, whether a hearer or a reader or a viewer, must then decode that linguistic expression based on their understanding of and experience with the conventions about what kinds of linguistic expressions are going to be associated with what kind of semantic content. And it's their prerogative to carry rhetoric through to its logical conclusion. And you can't say, no, I only bear responsibility for the proposition, not for the conclusion. So, for example, if someone is talking to a group of young Christians and they tell the young women, hey, if you want to get married someday, you can't have premarital sex. Oh, also don't be a victim of sexual abuse, because then you'll be like a piece of chewed gum or a licked cupcake, and nobody's going to want you after that. And that may be in their heads an attempt to rhetorically emphasize and escalate the importance of purity culture and chastity and their understanding of modesty. But the message that gets communicated is that your value is found in the pristineness of your genitals. And the message is that you are a piece of property. You are an object. And if you are sexually abused, or if you do engage in premarital sex, then you have lost your value as a commodity. You are damaged goods. And within our culture, you don't have any value anymore. And people have taken their lives, children have taken their lives because of that rhetoric. And the people who communicate it don't want to be responsible for the logical conclusion of their rhetoric. They just want to use the rhetoric and not be responsible for the outcomes of the rhetoric. You can't eat your cake and have it too. If you're going to engage in the rhetoric, you are responsible for the logical conclusions of that rhetoric.
Okay, he wasn't saying that the man's sin falls on the woman.
That is precisely what he said.
He also wasn't talking to all women. He was just talking to Christian women.
Utterly irrelevant.
And like it or not, as Christians as a whole, we are called to a different standard scripturally than what we have to expect from the world.
Yes, there are higher scriptural standards in the Bible. For instance, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, we have Jesus saying, you have heard that Moses said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, any man who looks lustfully at a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then the next verse doesn't say that woman shouldn't be dressing like that, or that woman shouldn't have the kind of body that has contours that show through her clothing. The next verse says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. So the only parts of the Bible that actually directly address men lusting after women places the blame entirely and exclusively on the part of the luster. And what is never once mentioned anywhere in any syllable of the Bible is a responsibility for a woman to cover any part of her body so that a man doesn't lust after her.
We are called to be set apart. We're called to be set apart in heart, how we carry ourselves, how we dress, how we act, how we speak. And one of the ways that we do that is how we dress.
Yes, there are a handful of places in the Bible where women are told not to dress in ways that are intended to project social status or wealth. So they're told to dress modestly, which is then defined as not having braided hair, not wearing makeup, not wearing jewelry, not wearing expensive clothing. And the disconnect is that a lot of people misunderstand the words in Hebrew and in Greek that are translated modesty as somehow a reference to how much skin is being exposed or what kind of contours of a body might be visible through clothing. The Bible never once addresses that. The Bible only addresses modesty as a question of expressions of status or wealth and tells women not to dress in ways that are intended to show off status or wealth.
We aren't responsible for our brother's sin, but we are responsible for carrying ourselves in such a way that with our speech, how we look and how we carry ourselves does not place a stumbling block in front of our brother.
So this is precisely what I mentioned earlier. It's an attempt to express a principle and deny responsibility for the logical conclusion of that principle. Because you're saying, oh, you're not responsible for your brother's sin, but you're responsible for your own behaviors that cause your brother to sin, which is just an attempt to try to create distance between the sin and the cause of the sin and say, no, you're not responsible for the sin, you're just responsible for causing the sin. That's absolutely asinine doublespeak. It's an attempt to say, I'm going to eat my cake and I'm also going to have it too. And it appeals to a tergiversation of other scriptures. This idea of not placing a stumbling block before a brother. That's Romans 14:13, which has absolutely nothing to do with how women dress. That is entirely and exclusively about eating foods sacrificed to idols. And it's the exact same point that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 8. The idea is basically this. There's nothing inherently sinful about eating food that has been sacrificed to idols, but new Christians might not know that. And if you are at a feast with young baby Christians, as some people call them, and they see you doing something they think is sinful, and then they follow your example and they do something that they understand to be sinful, that's the stumbling block. They have followed your example and done what you know is not a sin, but in their doing it, they think it's a sin because of this idea that Paul talks about in Romans 12 about different measures of faith. So what it's saying is, don't do something that you understand is not a sin because someone else might follow your example but think that they're engaging in sin and that would hurt their conscience. That's an entirely different circumstance. That is utterly irrelevant to the question of whether or not women can wear yoga pants to a gym. But a lot of Christians believe that they have license to tergiversate the scriptures like this because they're just trying to extrapolate a generalizable principle from a specific example. And this goes back to ancient Jewish hermeneutic principles, or midot. This one is binyan av echad, to be specific, building from a single father. In other words, you take an exemplar, a piece of legislation from the Torah, and you extrapolate a generalized principle that then you can apply to other circumstances that aren't directly addressed by that one law from the Torah. And so here the idea is, oh, Paul says not to put a stumbling block before a brother, therefore anything I identify as a stumbling block, I can condemn as something that somebody else shouldn't place before their brother. Nothing in this text supports the notion that stumbling block here means anything that might cause anyone else to sin. Nothing in the text supports the notion that women dressing in a specific way is a stumbling block and therefore is the responsibility of women not to place before their brethren. And we already have, as I pointed out, an example of Jesus directly blaming entirely and exclusively the viewer for lusting after a woman. So this is beginning from an identity marker and then going to the toy box of Lego bricks that is the Bible and trying to construct an edifice that matches this identity marker so you can then say, see, it's in the Bible. This is just identity politics. This is just trying to leverage the Bible as the authority for your own identity politics. And unfortunately, these particular identity politics are thoroughly misogynistic.
That includes how we dress. Not popular in the world, and I'm not saying go put on a full covering.
And here's another example of wanting to eat your cake and have it too, because that's precisely what you're saying, depending on the man, because the standard that you have asserted is not evoking lustful thoughts in the minds of men, but men have different minds. And there are men out there who are going to be filled with lustful thoughts if they see a woman covered head to toe in clothing who happens to move in a certain way that reveals the contours of a certain body part. And so you have absolutely no objective way of drawing the line between clothing that is responsible for evoking lustful thoughts and clothing that is not responsible for evoking lustful thoughts. Because I can go pull up tweets from pastors where they've said, I had to go tell this woman she needs to start wearing a bra to church, and she got upset with me, and I'm a victim now, when that woman was covered head to toe in clothing. So you have no way of drawing that line outside of just appealing to whatever socially conventionalized standard your particular social identity finds acceptable. Again, everything retreats to the authority of the identity politics.
But what I am saying is that we have our own calling to fulfill with Scripture, and he has his.
No, what you're saying is that women need to subordinate their interest and their agency to men, and that's just straight up misogyny. And the fit for this video has been Venom, the Lethal Protector.